In classical liberalism and the various philosophies therein, which birthed modern-day libertarian thought, many point to the influential figures who are thought to have contributed the most. Some are enshrined as the best the Enlightenment gave us. Think Jefferson, Locke, Montesquieu, Franklin, and Paine. While perhaps less directly relevant to today's status quo and the challenges we face, thinkers like these laid the groundwork for the values of classical liberalism and the libertarian trends that succeeded them. It is through these great enlightened thinkers that libertarians such as myself find inspiration and a worthy worldview. After these enshrined individuals come those who sought to answer the question of how this groundwork is best developed. While the aforementioned are perhaps the light at the end of the tunnel, these next influential people give us the vehicle with which we might cross said proverbial tunnel. Think figures like Lysander Spooner, Henry George, Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, Ayn Rand, Friedrich Hayek, Robert Nozick, Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, and Jordan Peterson. Okay, sorry. Too early for jokes. I'm still setting up the intro. Anyway, what I'm getting at here, dear viewer, is the fact that these thinkers have done a great deal and contributed much to libertarian political philosophy. I mean, come on, Nozick? If you don't like him, or even worse, know nothing of him, then what are you doing watching a channel called The Minarchist? Oh, I see now. Of course, you're waiting for my breakdown of his work. Yeah, that'll be a special moment for us, won't it? Anyway, you also have thinkers of the same austere caliber and cut from the very cloth of controversy like Ayn Rand, which, despite being just a touch dogmatic, I still believe she's not only worth reading, but studying. The woman was objectively inspiring, even if you've no interest in objectivist thought. I mean, my video on objectivism proved through the, very colorful comment section that those who hate her really throw the baby out with the bathwater, and those that love her and consider themselves objectivists, well, they just haven't any sense of humor. Like at all. Not even slightly. But who cares? She wasn't a libertarian. She made that abundantly clear throughout her lifetime. But she's still a good read. I mean, look, I like her. But there is an in-betweener of sorts, a brilliant man who in no uncertain terms embodied the common sense of Thomas Paine, understood the political pragmatism of Montesquieu and Benjamin Franklin, yet maintained the revolutionary and idealistic attitudes of Thomas Jefferson and John Locke. An in-betweener who came before the vehicle, but journeyed through that tunnel nonetheless. Frédéric Bastiat. A self-made man who witnessed government overreach, who educated himself without the help of academics, and who used these experiences in his essays, which attacked the statism that plagued not just his day, but ours. And so, 175 years later, his voice is as relevant as ever, and I'll show you how. You're watching The Minarchist, and this is Bastia, a relevant voice. Claude Frédéric Bastiat was born on June 30th, 1801 in Bayonne. Some say not much is known of his early life, but this isn't strictly speaking true. In reality, there's just not a whole lot to know. It's not like he was some mysterious intellectual titan, it's just that his average upbringing isn't really indicative of the brilliance of the man himself. In fact, it's so unassuming that most of his family members don't even have portraits or depictions of them, and his portraits and depictions only come after he achieved prominence. So I'm gonna do the best I can to paint that picture for you. The Bastia family, like most French citizens, was impacted by the Revolution, and then the Napoleonic era. And despite this tumultuous period, or the great detriment of being born French, his family did okay. They were involved in all sorts of businesses. Bayonne is a massive port city, still to this day, so naturally his family would be involved. They dealt in wine, goods, and the means to transport them, particularly to Spain. And after Spain was subdued by Napoleon, business was booming. His family was bourgeois, which, unlike the brain-dead definition used widely today, just means middle class. The House of Bastia was very middle class indeed. Their modest fortune was won in a twist of rags to riches meets revolutionary chaos. Now, Frederic wanted to go to a university. He always fancied himself a great thinker, and now in France, this was possible. You didn't need 20 titles to get a spot at a good university anymore. Hell, any crazy or deranged bastard could just publish his ideas. And people actually listened to them. Times were a-changing, but tragedy would soon strike poor young Frederic. His mother died when he was just 7, and only 2 years later, at age 9 in 1810, his father would die as well. Young Frederic had always wanted to be a man of letters, an intellectual. Another thing that was possible after the French Revolution. As I said, you just didn't have to be an aristocrat anymore, and at least on the surface the nation was more egalitarian. But sometimes the reality of life doesn't give way for one's dreams, something Bastia learned at only 9 years old. He had no grand fortune, grew up in the countryside, which made his dream difficult enough to achieve already. But now he was an orphan, inheriting his father's share of the family estate in Mougron, a small town in the French countryside just outside of Bayonne. And, being taken in by his grandfather, he'd be thrust into a life he didn't quite imagine for himself, but one which was nonetheless impressive. The family estate was no grand chateau. It would be more the early 19th century equivalent of a ranch house, modest by aristocratic standards of the time, surrounded by farmland and vineyards, so it was nothing to wag your finger at either. Though completely unobtainable by today's standards. I mean, come on, in this economy? Young Frederic would have to grow up fast, and he did. He learned at an early age that life has no mercy for those unwilling to take responsibility. So, from his adolescence, approximately 12 years old, to his early teens, his guardians, namely his grandfather and aunt, would give him a very important gift: the experience of practical knowledge. And while they did enroll him in school, this was purely general education, something quite common for the middle class. But it was becoming increasingly clear grand universities were just not in the cards he was dealt. He was to help run the estate, learn the ways of trade from his uncle, just as his father had done before him. And so, not before long, Frédéric Bastiat was managing a business by day and educating himself under the glow of candlelight by night. He then learned a harsh truth all entrepreneurs learn eventually. Government overreach was everywhere. You can build wealth all you want, but you'd best give the government their taste. For Frederic, this wasn't learned from dusty old tomes or by pretentious professors preaching abstract theory. He saw for himself how the tariffs and regulations of the French state was strangling small business. He saw how protectionism protected the few at the cost of the many. Still, he didn't give up, but his anger at the state fueled his self-taught education. He'd tend to the family business, and then retire to the works of Adam Smith, Rousseau, Voltaire, Locke, and Montesquieu, and it was through his studying economics, philosophy, and politics that would give him a thirst for liberty that he'd ultimately not quench in his lifetime. But it is still a thirst millions of us still share. Upon turning 17, he would obtain full responsibility of his own estate. He was not rich, had no place among the French elite, but it was not an uncomfortable life either. His economic studies had become more than a hobby as he educated himself further and had the practical knowledge to back it up, but his interest in politics had only grown. And now that he had the agency to do whatever he wanted to do, he began looking toward another career, that as a thinker, a statesman, an economist. He just wasn't content within the family business anymore, but this shouldn't be taken to mean that he was careless. He left it in the hands of very capable managers, and he still oversaw its operations. It is at this point in Bastiat's story that a childhood friend of his would become somewhat of an intellectual sparring partner, Félix Caudroy. Félix, however, had left-leaning views. He was a socialist who had been born into privilege. Just as with Bastiat's family, there exists no reliable depictions of Félix Caudroy de l'Aubespin. So, for all intents and purposes, this is him. He had been educated in Paris, had a grand European tour under his belt, and wanted for nothing. During his time in the grand universities that Bastiat could only dream of and replicate on his own time, Félix Caudroy was taken in by proto-Marxist French socialists, a version of socialism that predated Marx by about 20 years, but no less poisonous to academia. And I mean, this was classic. Their arguments and debates were eerily similar to ones we would have today.
Kill them! Kill those motherfuckers! And murder those motherfuckers in the street! Let the streets soak in their fucking red capitalist bloods, dude. Kill them!
So you have this self-made man being talked down to by his rich commie friend. One of the reasons we don't know that much about dear Félix outside of Bastiat's accounts and correspondence with him is generally thought to be a result of his guilt. Félix didn't want the image of a rich man, but that of the man of the people, so he wasn't keen on commissioning portraits of his own likeness. However, it should be stated that that is just pure conjecture, we're not entirely certain. Regardless, he would fade into obscurity. Bastiat would later remember him as the perfect foil to hone his more liberty-minded ideals. From that, he inspired key figures of the movement. For example, Henry Hazlitt, famous economist and author best known for his work Economics in One Lesson. Then there was Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, the fathers of the Austrian School of Economics. You also had Milton Friedman, the father of the Chicago School of Economics. And of course, Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe of the anarcho-capitalist tradition. Even the great Ron Paul counted Bastiat's works in his great libraries of liberty. These figures who have very little in common, and they all recommend a few works by Frédéric Bastiat for any collection. So, now that we know the man's story pretty well, let's take a look at Bastiat's ideas. Slavery, protection, and monopoly find defenders, not only in those who profit from them, but somehow in those who suffer from them as well. What Bastiat is saying here is simple. Obviously, those who profit from these things aren't going to argue against it, but even those who suffer by it may just do the same, be it through a misunderstanding and the immediate benefit, a sort of don't rock the boat kind of thing, or through a nationalistic sentiment, or simply ideologically. Protectionism, like via tariffs, may look good on the surface, but this is what Bastiat referred to as the seen, and he argued this obscures the unseen. What is seen is that a factory may see immediate benefits domestically. They are safe from competition that might destroy them. They see an increase in profits, the workers see an increase in benefits. But what is unseen is the increase in the price of goods, the wasted resources, and the creeping costs of living. Bastiat also saw this as only a service to special interests rather than examples of true capitalism. Bastiat highlights this dynamic in his satirical work, The Candlemaker's Petition, in which he jokingly lobbies the state to block out the sun to increase the profits of the suffering candlemakers.
No, get those lights off! Off!
Speaking of the president, let's apply Bastiat's argument to a more relevant issue: American conservatives, Republicans, and Trump supporters have, in recent years, become far more protectionist. And while this isn't anything new, be it in either Bastiat's time or through the history of the Republican Party, it is at the forefront of current policy. Now, President Donald Trump does make a fair point when it comes to tariffs. Other countries tariff our goods. Why should we not impose the same in order to get a fairer deal? Make them pay their fair share, protect American industry, and stop cheap Chinese goods from flooding our economy. I personally want to see America maintain its status economically. But Bastiat would say that this is all going toward that which is seen. What is unseen, a modern Bastiat may say, is the creeping inflation on the price of goods and services. Yes, 10,000 jobs are saved here, but 100,000 are lost there. Bastiat would, and has, said that we are in essence picking winners and ensuring losers. Now, using the current economic strain with China as a prime example, one could say, well, who gives a shit if China loses if we win? Fair. But, as Bastiat points out, this is not the case. With tariffs, it's not money changing hands between Beijing and Washington, but between the state and American businesses. Politicians stand up in the chamber and cheer, "Yeah, we stuck it to China." But it's really you who ends up paying more. And what ends up happening is economic retaliation, as tariffs don't just happen in a vacuum. They aren't one-off things, they end up creating a vicious cycle. Bastiat would tell us today, probably losing the cravat and delivering a keynote in a fancy turtleneck, that cheap goods aren't a curse, but a blessing. He believed that if another country is leading in cheap crap, well, that's a good thing. It gives your country the opportunity to actually focus on the things that it excels at. Rather than getting angry that it's not your cheap crap being bought up, start leading in a new market. And if you actually want to buy cheap crap from your own country, you'll be able to do so with the money in your pocket not being drained by tariffs. In short, Bastiat would understand and sympathize with these policies. He is not saying a people ought to sell their own country out. He's saying it's a foolish endeavor to fight the natural exchange of markets. But this idea of his gives rise to the most important intellectual contribution to classical liberalism and libertarianism. Now, while Frédéric Bastiat saw the effects of protectionism on business firsthand in Bayonne and Mougron, it was later in life, after becoming an accomplished statesman and intellectual, and seeing the throes of revolution across Europe in 1848, that he honed his philosophy against protectionism and identified it as merely a symptom of a wider problem, what he called legal plunder. This concept, unlike his stance on protectionism, which was purely economical, is more philosophical. It explains how tariffs, taxes, and regulations begin to suffocate free societies. According to Bastiat, we hold from God the gift that, as far as we are concerned, contains all others: life, physical, intellectual, and moral life. He says this as a preface to the classically liberal ideal that we've a natural right to life, liberty, and property. But to Bastiat, this was simply the very core of civilization. Laws, according to Bastiat, should only be enacted to serve justice, which revolves around life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or property, depending on who you asked. Bastiat believed that legal plunder arises when a people's concept of justice is perverted by a common apathy or lack of responsibility. That when laws no longer serve a concrete ideal of justice, but simply the passing of more laws, this leads to a larger governmental institution to keep track of said laws, and then pass more laws, to the point of a citizen not knowing exactly what even is or is not legal, or even constitutional anymore. And this is often done in the name of safety, not liberation. In Bastiat's theory, a just government would protect persons against plunder. It is uncivilized to plunder another's property, or threaten another's freedoms or life. Thus, government steps in to protect citizens from other citizens looking to plunder. However, should the government begin to make amendments to this concrete concept of justice, i.e., it is now okay to plunder under very specific circumstances, this makes justice an abstract concept. If we can be allowed to plunder others, then nothing stops the government from plundering our property in the name of safety, or for our own good. This, Bastiat declares, is not justice. Well, novel concept, I know, but he develops this philosophical concept in his most important work, The Law, published in 1850. In it, he writes, "When law and morality contradict each other, the citizen is left with the cruel alternative of either losing his moral sense or losing his respect for the rule of law." He also said that the birth of the United States is proof of this dynamic. The crown stops its subjects from plundering, but can legally plunder its subjects. In this instance, the loyalists in early America can be seen as those who have lost their moral sense, and the rebels as those who lost their respect for the rule of law. Here's another example. A corporate bailout, like those given to airline companies during the pandemic. This is an example of legal plunder, and because it's sold as a net positive for a nation and its people, it goes ignored. Or economic subsidies. This is sold to us as fairness in principle, and we are told to ignore being plundered because the spoils go to all of us. Though how this is organized is typically very obscured depending on the size of the populace. Even public education was attacked by Bastia, not because education is bad, but because so long as an educator's livelihood and survival is dependent on the proceeds of plunder, they can be expected to defend it in their work and influence their pupils to accept this injustice. In short, they are incentivized to champion state intervention, but Bastiat's warning cuts even deeper. So long as legal plunder is allowed, everyone demands a turn at it. If the rich plunder the poor, resentment rises and the poor demand redistribution of wealth. If the poor plunder the rich, the wealthy demand privileges and protection to shield their wealth. And so, the end result becomes a societal tug-of-war of legalized theft, with no end in sight as the government becomes an arbitrary institution that upholds an arbitrary concept of justice. The Parable of the Broken Window. Yeah, that intro makes sense now, doesn't it? To further develop his philosophy on that which is seen and unseen, he created a thought experiment. Namely, to illustrate that destruction and the money spent on relief efforts isn't actually beneficial to society, and combats the belief that destruction is actually good for an economy. Though, I mean, who actually believes that? Oh yeah, he was from France. Anyway, the parable is simple. Okay, so, imagine, you're walking down the street. La 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 la, you know, just taking in the sights. Ah, majestic. And then... oh no! Your loud next-door neighbor's little ankle-biting bastard just threw a rock into a poor shopkeep's window. That little shit, you may mutter to yourself. But then, you have a revelation. This might benefit society. After all, accidents such as these keep the local glassmaker in business. Yes, the shopkeep pays the glass guy who pays the maker who lives on that dough. Win-win, you think to yourself. But hold right there, Bastia tells you. That little rock-throwing asshole isn't stimulating the economy. How so? Well, this is where opportunity costs come in. You see, the proceeds of that shopkeeper's business now go into replacing something he already had. Now, looks like his shop's inventory might just suffer a bit. Or his annoying wife doesn't get that necklace she's been nagging him over since last spring. Now, that necklace is out of fashion. She's threatening to leave and take their non-vandalizing, well-behaved children away, and the jeweler, the poor jeweler, is now outside with the rest of the scenery. These were all opportunities that the shopkeep couldn't take because now he has to replace that goddamn window. Now, this was obviously an exaggerated example of the micro level, but on the macro level, let's apply that to something bigger. Well, in a very succinct manner, like the Great Depression. I'm sure you've heard the argument that the Second World War ended the Depression through a wartime economy. Well, kinda, but not quite. What was seen as the United States shifted towards wartime production were humming factories filled with the recently unemployed churning out machines like hotcakes. But then can you eat a bomb? Can you live in a warship? I admit it would be pretty badass, but you typically can't. Is this then a strong economy? Or a simple command economy with temporary success? What is unseen are the houses not built until after the war, the rationing of goods and thus the comforts of daily life denied to an entire generation. We spent blood, money, and steel to get back what we already had. Half the world was rubble, and rebuilding rubble doesn't quite make for prosperity. It just gets you back to square one. Oh yes, it takes a village. Or rather, more often, it takes a village to raise a child. Common phrases used to feign a sense of solidarity. You know, let's all pull together. Be a team. It takes a common effort to reach our goal. Be it an idea, a concept, or sometimes a literal child. In reality, it's an excuse to not mind your own goddamn business, used by nosy utopians who mean to impose their will on individual freedoms. Well, I don't know if she was very utopian. But this is a phrase that is employed by those who value state paternalism, as Bastiat called it. It's a collectivist mantra that softly asks the listener to surrender their individual rights. Now, earlier I delved into Bastiat's notion that legal plunder comes from a perversion of the law, which itself comes from an apathetic and irresponsible people. A reliance on state paternalism, then, is both our starting point in the string of events leading to tyranny, and a recurring issue as the state passes more laws to anchor its growth into every aspect of civilized life. This is what Bastiat called the nanny state. It infantilizes its citizens, who begin to see the village as the solution to every problem, not the villager. A declaration of dependence, as it were, or as he put it, the very basis of socialism. It's disguised as compassion, as what you need because you really know no better. And this is why socialism, even in its softest of forms, always drifts towards coercion. Bastiat's message here is simple. The state is not your parent, your teacher, or your village. The more it acts like one, the more it reduces free people into helpless children. But a real society doesn't need the state to raise it. It needs the freedom for people to raise themselves. As Bastia himself said, they think of humanity as inert matter, ready to receive everything. Form, shape, impulse, movement, life, from a great legislator. I will say this, though. Bastiat thought that real justice wasn't between shepherds and sheep, but allowing the ventures of people, and likewise allowing them to rest on their victories or shoulder their own defeats. Now, he's not very remarkable for what he said. It's really no different than the rest of those libertarian principles, but he's admirable and remarkable for when he said it and how. The only thing, to my mind, that I personally dislike about the man is how relevant his words still are. Now, we're wrapping this video up, and you might be thinking, where are the solutions? These are only complaints, no different from those offered up by any old libertarian crackpot. Well, simple. He didn't have the time to put a finer point on things, as you'll soon see. But I believe his solution was nothing. It's already embedded in his ideals and warnings, that the belief in some collective centralized idea of a solution leads only to the perversion of justice. But if you want to get to know Bastiat's works for yourself, as always, my sources are in the description below. Bastiat would write his most well-known work, The Law, in 1850, and he'd die shortly after. Let's see how his story played out. After achieving prominence as an essayist and pamphleteer, the revolutions of 1848 would sweep Europe, taking up where the ideals of earlier revolutions left off, after the Old World conservative order had finalized Napoleon's defeat, hoping Europe would return to its rightful, more feudalistic existence. It did not. In France, a confusing monarchy would be thrown out on its ass again, and Bastia would find himself in the National Assembly representing his home turf. His time in office is kinda like that of the tenure of the Pauls. In the United States Congress, he made the most sense, but nobody would get on board because his big words hurt their ears. So he usually just spent his time fighting socialists and other utopian ideologues through spirited debate. And he just represented his constituents to the best of his ability, and appealed to the people with his ideas to great success. However, he soon began to weaken physically. He had been sick for much of 1847, but it passed. It was probably pneumonia, but by 1849, the symptoms came back again and again. He'd take a little time off and then go right back to it. But it was progressively getting worse. On one autumn morning, he discovered alarming amounts of blood in his mucus. His coughing fits became worse. Sending for a doctor, he would receive news no one in the 19th century ever wanted to hear. Frédéric Bastiat was dying of consumption, better known as tuberculosis. He took the news in stride and continued about his work, his voice weaker, his ability to debate stifled, but his pen was stronger than ever. He'd finish his work, The Law, in 1850. In its final pages, he suggests, "Until my dying day, I shall proclaim this truth with all the force of my lungs, which, alas, is far too inadequate." It was getting much worse. His doctor suggested he leave France's damp climate and go someplace far more warm and dry. Best case, he would recover. Worst case, he'd at least be a bit more comfortable. On Christmas Eve, 1850, in Rome, surrounded by his closest friends, his final hours would play out.